Welcome, everyone, to our regular weekday morning podcast on Kabbalah for Heretics. And I'm your heretic in chief, Yaakov Leva Cohen. And let's get back to where we left off in our last podcast, which is in volume 4 of the Zohar. For those of you who may be first time listeners, let me point out that for the past almost 30 years, and I mean that 30 years, every weekday morning, without exception, except for some very rare exceptions, such as I was in the hospital for 2.5 months recently. Without exception, every weekday morning for almost 30 years, we have been teaching on the Zohar systematically, volume by volume, page by page, sentence by sentence. We're in and very close to being finished with volume 4. And when we do finish volume 4, God willing, I will, with all of you, enter into volume 5, the final volume of the Zohar. As I say, let's get back to where we left off. And we come to a passage of written scripture which the Zohar is going to break open for its esoteric meaning, for its true meaning. Remember, according to 4,000 years of tradition, when God gave Moses the Torah, he gave it to him in two forms: in written form, that we are familiar with, but also in oral form, the oral Torah, which Moses was instructed not to write down. It got it written down 300 AD, but nonetheless, Moses was instructed to pass it on orally. And the oral Torah is more or less a user's manual. The Zohar and other works of oral Torah are more or less a user's manual for the written Torah. It explains what appears to be inexplicable and corrects those errors that are intentionally in the written Torah and adds to those statements and scriptures in the written Torah that need to be added to. So the Zohar is an extremely important document. And the Gentiles were furious when they discovered that there was a Zohar, and as well as when they discovered there was a Talmud. And we all know what they did with that in response. So what you're listening to here is considered equal in authority to the written Torah, which you call the Bible. You weren't raised with it, but that's the whole point. You weren't meant to be until now. The question can be raised, well, why now? Why not? Well, the answer is given by the rabbis, and quite conclusively, even modern rabbis. When the Messiah comes, the Zohar will be open to all: Gentile, Jew, child, adult, man, woman. And it is obligatory on those who can that they teach it publicly, openly. We claim that Messiah has come. Came first with Yeshua, but then again with Shabtai Tzvi, who himself said in many ways that he came to abrogate the and to revise it along the line. So that's why we feel that we can now teach openly. By the way, at last count, there were 5,000 listeners out there. So we're doing as we have been instructed by God to do. Baruch Hashem. We come to a written scripture that the Zohar is going to break open. And the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron, saying, These are the living things which we shall eat, etc. Now, you can see by the language, if you have an inclination toward the Zohar and Kabbalah and mysticism, you can see right away there's something here. These are the living things. Notice the choice of the words, living things, which you shall eat, etc. This is from Leviticus, and it will be a list of those kosher and unkosher things to eat. But in introducing it, the scripture says these are the living things. The Zohar then says, why was Aaron joined with Moses here? Notice it says, and the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron. Why also to Aaron? See, this is the Zohar. This is Kabbalah. It asks these kinds of questions of the scripture and gives valid answers based on the oral Torah that was given at the same time to Aaron by Moses. To Moses, pardon me, by God. So it says, why was Aaron joined with Moses here? Why does it say, spoke unto Moses and to Aaron? Why not just Moses? Because it was always his function to divide between the clean and the unclean. It was always Aaron's function to divide between the clean and the unclean. Aaron, the high priest, from whom by genome study I am directly related as a Kohen, who was the first Kohen, one of his functions was to divide between the clean and the unclean, which means to divide between the left-hand side and the right-hand side of God, the 10 Sephiros. Because it was his function to divide between the clean and the unclean. We see that in various examples. Aaron was the one who a person thought to have leprosy was brought to, and Aaron decided whether that was leprosy or not. He divided between the clean and the unclean. Now, let me just point out in an aside, that's all right, except it is the reunification of God, not the division of God, that is the purpose of mankind, and especially of Aaron and Moses. But here, in a different context, it says, because Aaron was always meant to be between the clean and the unclean. Rabbi Abba, one of the rabbis sitting and discussing this, expounded in this connection the verse, quote, what man is he that desireth life and loveth many days that he may see good? Life here said, quote, the world to come, where true life abides. Similarly, the tree of life means the tree that springs from that life and is planted therein. Now look, let's back up a moment. Those of you who are Zohar, either by studying with me or others, know that the world to come is a very, very common, I don't mean common in the negative sense, it's a very often quoted statement, the world to come. Now, on its most superficial level, that means life after death. But it's more than that. The Zohar is always more than that. The world to come is a state of consciousness which we are struggling through the Zohar and its secret teachings to achieve. A state of consciousness where there are no divisions. There isn't even a me or a you. It is what the Hindus call samadhi, for example. The Buddhists have another name for it. But it is a here and now state of consciousness that is achieved through spiritual theurgic means that are being described here in the Zohar. The world to come, where true life abides, it is also the life after death, but in its initial form, in the state of consciousness, it is experiencing what one, in the here and now, what one will experience at death, so that one is prepared for the world to come at death. Life in this context, he said, is the life which is called the world to come, where true life abides. That state of consciousness spoken of here, described as samadhi or enlightenment in Hinduism, is where true life abides. It is not the empirical life, which is not true life. True life is, as the Hindus also point out, an illusion. That state of consciousness that one can enter into even in the here and now, when one achieves that, there is no longer this or that, here or there. There's only it. That is the true life, undivided, unitary, where I do not exist, the ego does not exist. The physical body is there, but outside of the consciousness being discussed. The tree of life means the tree that springs from that life and is planted therein. That is the path, the tree of life, the Eitz Chaim, the 10 Sephiros are the map, the path toward the world to come, both in this life and after. Similarly, the tree of life means the tree that springs from that life and is planted therein, the 10 Sephiros. By days, here is signified the name of the Holy King, which is attached to the supernal days called the days of heaven over earth. Now let's point something out here. Notice the word for God here is the Holy King, Holy King. That's not just some casual use of a casual name. It's very specific. Other places, he's called the Holy One, blessed be he, and so forth. Here, it is called the Holy King. That identifies the level of God's consciousness from which this tree emerges. And that level of consciousness that is secretly intended to mean tree of life is connected to the first Sephira, which is Holy King, Atika Kadisha. You'll remember each of the 10 Sephiros has a parzuf, a hidden name, that really truly explains its deeper meaning. So here it's saying that the Holy King is the source of the tree. That means that Atika Kadisha, the first Sephira, Keter, crown, is the source from which the remaining 9 Sephiros representing the mind of God emerges. He who desires to have a portion in the higher life, notice it doesn't say necessarily the world to come. It says the higher life, which is the world to come, as experienced in this here and now. He who desires to have a portion in the higher life and to cleave to the eternal days should above all keep guard over his mouth and his tongue. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. He should preserve his mouth from food and drink which defile the soul, and remove man from those supernal days in life. And he should keep his tongue from words of evil, so as not to be defiled from them. Further, mouth and tongue are names given to the supernal places, and therefore a man should be careful not to bring a stain on his mouth and tongue. Now, this deals with something very important. In the passage that it's describing, it deals with the foods that may or may not be eaten in the laws of kashrut. But we're being told it also deals with other things of the mouth and tongue, which is speech, unholy speech, gossip. What it's referring to is gossip about another. It's called Lashon Hara. There are great volumes written about it. Is the equivalent of unkosher food, forbidden, because speaking the word on the tongue, speaking the evil, gossipy word on the tongue is equivalent to eating unclean food on the tongue. Now, this issue of Lashon Hara is so profound and so ignored and so resisted by people that it's amazing. There is a great volume of oral Torah called Lashon Hara. And it deals with all the rules of evil speech, principally speaking badly of another when that person is not present, gossip, and to further qualify it, good or bad, it's just speaking of a third person who is not present, primarily speaking badly of that person, gossiping about that person. Do you hear what's being said here? I've had students who say, well, then what else is there to talk about? And they mean it. And crises emerge in the 40-some years of my teaching out of Lashon Hara among students. I've seen whole spiritual ministries destroyed by evil speech, being forbidden here. The true tzaddik, the true priest, knows how to encounter and counteract that Lashon Hara and its effects, but we are forbidden from engaging in it, just as God forbids us to eat certain unclean animals and things. God forbids us from speaking unclean words and thoughts, principally about each other. You would be amazed at what that means, as explained in the volume of scripture, Lashon Hara. It's amazing. Even if two people are together and they're talking about a third person, and they start by saying, oh, what a great person. Oh, my God, yes. He gives the shirt off his back to everybody, and they're talking about him in the most favorable terms. That is forbidden. Why? Because invariably it turns to, oh yeah, he may do all that, but nobody really realizes what a truly selfish person he is. And zip, there they are in the negative. So we are forbidden to speak of a third person who is absent at all, particularly if it's going to be negative. Lashon Hara, evil speech. Now, I just know that there are among the 5,000 of you listening out there, there are people who are really offended by that and are using every trick in the ego's book to deny it. But here it is, right in the Zohar. I'm not putting it in. There it is. To the best of my ability, I strive to not engage in Lashon Hara. Yes, I will sometimes do it, as everybody does. The issue is putting the brakes on it as best you can. But again, I'll never forget, and this is an absolutely true thing. One of my students, when I taught on Lashon Hara, really said, well, then what else do we have to talk about? And if you think about it, most people gossip. The content of most people's interaction is based on gossip about other people. Think of it. I mean, even if two people are sitting there speaking badly of the president of the States, that's Lashon Hara. It's forbidden in an extreme example. Similarly, he should preserve his mouth from food and drink, which defile the soul and remove man from those supernal days in life. Now look, this raises a terribly important issue. I want each of you out there listening to just quiet your mind and listen to. Most people, particularly Gentiles who think they know, but most Jews even, say that the laws of kashrut, what we can eat and not eat, are based on health measures alone. I'm sure if you think about it, that's what you've heard and probably believe. You may not eat pork because it's unhealthy, etc. That is not the rules of kosher. A food is kosher or unkosher because if it is unkosher, it defiles the soul, not the body. Do you hear that? Now I want you all to write that down on your foreheads. He who desires to have a portion in the higher life and to cling to the supernal days should above all keep guard over his mouth and his tongue, what he eats as well as drinks. There's a midrash on that I have always felt was just beautiful. Midrash is, again, an explanation, orally transmitted, an explanation of a written scripture. And the midrash goes, because the dogs of Egypt did not bark when the Israelites fled, and that's true. The Torah tells us, the written Torah says, not a dog barked. And this midrash says, because the dogs did not bark when the Israelites, and therefore alert the Egyptians, therefore they were rewarded with the unclean portions of the animals. What was forbidden to mankind to eat from the animal was given instead to the dogs as a reward. But the Midrash goes on and it says, therefore, as the dogs stand at the gates of heaven, they do not permit one who has eaten the unclean portions to enter, saying to them, you may not enter because you ate our portion. Now that tells us a great deal more than just about kosher and unkosher. Think to yourself, what is that telling us? It's midrash. It's oral Torah. What is it telling us? It's telling us, first of all, that dogs go to heaven. Therefore, when the dog stands at the gates of heaven, and furthermore, they're like St. Peter. They judge who may and may not enter based on whether that person has eaten unclean food and drink or not. Animals, dogs. Anyone who has lived with dogs, as I have and many of the people I know have, know that is obviously so. Those 3 lunkheads sitting on my couch listening, my 3 dogs, all my animals, clearly have a soul. It's enough of a soul to get them to the gate of heaven, not necessarily into heaven. That's a higher level of soul which they can achieve through mankind. But they do have a soul, so much so that they can judge who may and may not enter into heaven. They are the canine St. Peter. They are the canine St. Peter. We'll continue with this in our next podcast. In the meantime, let me do as I do at the end of every podcast, which is to recite the sacred Kaddish, the ritual prayer for the dead, in honor of the memory of our departed beloved friend and fellow Cohen. Yiskadal v'yiskadash meira bo, bo mo divo chirusei v'yamlich machusei, v'chayachon of yomechon of chayei d'chol beis Yisrael, bagala uvizman kove v'imru amen. Yehi shmeira bo meverach le'elam omeo maya, Yisbarach v'yishtabach v'yizba'ah v'yisamam, v'yisnasei v'yisadav v'yisalei v'yisalal shmei d'kutra b'richu. Le'elam mincha b'yirchasa v'shirasa tushbechasa, v'nechemasa damerim bomo v'imru amen. Yehi shlomo rabba min chaya, v'eleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'imru amen. Osei shalom b'mramav, hu ya'asei shalom, oleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'imru amen. And let everybody listening say Amen. Now let me ask if any of the 2 recording technicians who are always here have any comment about today's portion. Raise your hand if you do. David or Yeshai. I didn't think so. That's fine. That's just fine. All right, well, that concludes today's podcast. God willing, He will give me life again, and we will again resume our study of the Zohar. In the meantime, Yivarechecha Adonai.